The coffee mug slips from Dan's fingers. Down on the lawn, a neighbor lifts his bloodied face and sniffs the air. He's looking for his next victim. And right in Dan's pupils, a blue line glows. Applied chemistry, grade E. Advice? Lock yourself in. 3 seconds ago, he was writing his dissertation on low-temperature catalysts. He took off his headphones because a scream pierced through the music. He pulled back the curtain and saw Mr. Henderson tearing his wife's face apart with his teeth, right on the lawn in front of the house. A blue window hangs in the air like a screen glued to his pupils. Survival system, infection, carrier, So Jun-ho. A screen glued to his pupils. Survival system, infection, carrier, So Jun-ho. Dan blinks. The window doesn't disappear. He turns his head. The window follows his gaze. And his mind is already working. His mind has always worked. It's the only thing he's ever been good at. The garage door will hold if propped up with a workbench. The windows can be boarded up with plywood from the attic. And in the basement, there are 10 liters of hydrogen peroxide, acetone, ammonia, concentrated nitric acid. He isn't unarmed. He just doesn't know yet exactly what he's armed with. Dan closes his laptop. He checks the door. It's locked. And he goes down to the basement to count the chemicals. With Junho. 26 years old, a graduate student in the Department of Organic Chemistry on the outskirts of Portland. Quiet. Intense. He mutters formulas when he's nervous. His mother died 2 years ago. His father flew to Seoul for heart treatment last spring and disappeared on the 4th day of the epidemic. Dan forbids himself from thinking about it. He inherited the house along with his father's mortgage and workshop. He turns on the lamp and counts. 30% hydrogen peroxide, 10 liters. Acetone, nitric acid, ammonia, sulfuric acid, lye, potassium permanganate. Chemists never throw away reagents. And now that habit is worth more than gold. Upstairs, something is thudding against the wall. The scraping of nails against the siding. Silence. Dan doesn't go up. He doesn't check. He sits down on the step and writes a second list. What can be made from what's available? Chloramine, gas, hypochlorite plus ammonia. There's bleach under the sink. An incendiary mixture. Gasoline from the lawnmower plus laundry detergent as a thickener. A corrosive trap. Alkali and water. The list grows. And by the 3rd page, Dan realizes a simple thing. He isn't helpless. He's dangerous. He's sitting on a mountain of ingredients that, in the right combinations, kill. People are screaming outside. Lots of voices. They scream and then fall silent. Dan doesn't run. He takes out a marker and draws a floor plan of the house on the wall. All the entrances, all the exits, all the vents. Panic is a luxury for those who don't understand what's happening. He understands enough. The first night, he sits in a chair by the door with a hammer. A stupid weapon, but the only one at hand. Something shuffles behind the door. It leaves. It returns. Dan counts in his head. The object returns every 8 minutes. Territory. Memory. So they're not quite dead. Means the nervous system is working. Means there's something to poison them with. He writes it down. The infected are drawn to the scent. Mr. Henderson was sniffing the air when he looked up. Dan underlines the word 3 times. If they're drawn to the scent, any reaction turns the house into a target. But the scent can be directed. The scent can be made into bait, or a weapon, or both. The second day begins with plywood. Dan hauls sheets down from the attic. His hands are shaking. Each sheet weighs 15 kilos and feels like a ton. He doesn't go to the gym. He doesn't run. But he hauls. Window after window. 8 windows. 8 sheets. Every hammer blow rings in his ears. He freezes after each one, listens, strikes again. By noon, the first floor is closed off. Dark, stuffy. Then the garage door. He moves his father's oak workbench, centimeter by centimeter across the concrete, sweat in his eyes. 120 kilos of oak and cast iron stand by the door. On the second day, he decides to poke the blue window. It opens. The unlocking tree is like a subway map, nodes and lines. Only the first one is lit. Applied chemistry. Branches extend from it, gas mixtures, incendiary compounds, electrochemistry, pharmacology. Everything is gray, locked. The cost of the first unlock is 5 points. Source of points? Destroying the infected. And this is where it gets interesting. Bonus multipliers, resource conservation, cascading destruction, zone control. Elegance of the solution. Those who run around with bats get 1 point per zombie. A dumb way. But if you calculate the doptas, if you take out a dozen with a single blow, a cascade bonus, a control bonus. Dan closes the window. And for the first time in 2 days, he smiles. The crooked smile of a man who has understood the rules of the game and realized they were written just for him. The rest of the day is spent on the door between the hallway and the basement. Heavy, from the garage. He files the hinges with a rasp for 3 hours, but it fits, tightly, with a rubber gasket, gas tight. If the hallway becomes a contaminated zone, the basement will remain clean. Dan stands by the new door and sees the house not as a house, but as a system of volumes. The kitchen is 20 cubic meters. The hallway is 15. The basement is 40. Each volume can be flooded with gas. Each can be ventilated. Each can be isolated. He takes a marker and writes on the wall. The time it takes to fill the hallway with chloramine, lethal concentration, amount of reagent, exposure time. Formulas are scrawled on the plaster in black and white, like on a blackboard in a lecture hall. Only now, the exam is a matter of life and death. Day 3. They're coming. 5 of them. Shuffling along the wall, banging on the kitchen window. Boom, boom, boom. Just like a metronome. Dan doesn't wait. He opens the cabinet. Bleach, drain cleaner, a bucket on the hallway floor, both bottles inside, a lit rag for convection. Hot air rises and pulls the gas with it, speeds up the mixing. A crack. The plywood breaks. They climb inside. Dan slams the metal door shut, the latch, a respirator over his face. The camera shows the hallway, a greenish fog, chloramine. The first one enters the cloud. 2 steps, 3. On the 4th, he jerks. On the 5th, he grabs his throat. He falls. The 2nd follows. The 3rd. The 4th. The 5th. They fall one after another, scratching their throats, slamming into the walls, falling silent. A blue window flashes. +1, +1, +1, +1, +1. Bonus. Controlled zone. Resource savings. Total 7. Unlocked. Gas mixtures level 1. A new node lights up blue. Dan takes off his respirator. He sits down on a step and laughs quietly. Not out of joy, out of understanding. He really can get through this. Ventilating the hallway took 4 hours. Dan opened the ventilation dampers and turned the bathroom exhaust fan up to maximum. The electricity was still holding out. The city grid was on automatic, but Dan knew it wouldn't last long. A week, maybe 2, then everything would go dark. He jotted it down in his notebook. Priority, off-grid power. Solar panels at the neighbors' 2 houses down. When the fan had run for 4 hours, Dan put on a respirator and entered the hallway with a test tube. Silica gel, saturated with palladium chloride. Air through the tube. If there's chloramine, the silica gel darkens. Clean. Safe. 5 bodies on the floor, twisted. Fingers dug into their throats, mouths open, eyes whitish. Dan forced himself to look. Don't look away. If he looks away every time, he won't last long. He crouched down next to the nearest one, a man in a work jumpsuit, an air conditioning service patch. He went from door to door. He was bitten. 40 minutes, and he ceased to be human. His eyes were completely cloudy. His skin was pale with a grayish tint. But it wasn't rotting. No smell of death. The tissues looked preserved, as if decomposition had stopped the moment of transformation. The prion was restructuring his metabolism. The cells weren't dying. They were switching. To what? Unclear. But if the bodies don't decompose, they'll lie there for a long time and attract others. The smell of blood, the smell of damaged tissue, a beacon. Pulling the bodies out took the rest of the day, each weighing between 60 and 90 kilos. Dan weighed 72, 60% of normal muscle mass. He dragged them by the legs across the hallway floor, through the kitchen, to the broken window, hauled them out. 20 minutes per body, 5 bodies, an hour and a half. By the end, he was lying on the kitchen floor and couldn't lift his arms. He wrote it down later with a trembling hand. Physical fitness, critical deficit. If he had to run, he wouldn't make it 200 meters. The only weapon is distance, traps, barriers. There must always be a wall between him and the threat, or gas, or fire. Never open space. Day 4. Silence. No banging on the walls, no shuffling. The cameras showed an empty street, bodies on the lawns, an overturned trash can, and no one. The silence was scarier than the noise. Noise means it's close by and you can prepare. Silence means it's somewhere, but you don't know where. Dan used the silence. He climbed into the attic. Tools, metal shears, aluminum tape, sheet metal from the garage. All day in the ceiling cavities, dust, cobwebs, a flashlight between his teeth. He cut the air ducts and inserted dampers, sealed the joints. By evening, 3 independent ventilation circuits. The hallway and the kitchen. The basement, the second floor. Each circuit could be shut off with a single damper. Each could be ventilated separately. The house had become a multi-zone laboratory with a controlled atmosphere. Dan stood in the hallway and looked at his marker pen markings. Airflow arrows, affected zones, emission points. Not pretty. Scribbles on the white walls where Mom used to hang photos. But it works. Day 5. The power flickered. 4 seconds of darkness, then it came back. Warning, the grid is dying. Dan wrote it in big letters. Solar panels, today. That meant the first outing in 5 days. 2 houses to the west lived the Nguyen family, 4 solar panels on the roof. Mr. Nguyen was a meticulous engineer, wires and cable channels. The inverter was surely in the garage. Dan had seen the Nguyen family on the 3rd day. All 4 were walking down the street. Pale eyes, identical stride, a family even in death. Dan closed his eyes. Then he opened them. Then he began to get ready. 3 hours to get ready. Respirator, goggles, double gloves, a jacket zipped up to his neck, a screwdriver and an adjustable wrench in his backpack, a 100-milliliter bottle of ammonia in his left pocket. If an infected person gets close, splash it in their face. His sense of smell is heightened tenfold. Concentrated ammonia in his nose feels like a sledgehammer blow to his receptors. A few seconds of confusion, enough to run away, if he can run on his own 2 feet. In his right pocket, a lighter and a rag soaked in gasoline. Dan stood at the back of the door, hand on the doorknob, heart pounding in his ears. Behind the door, a world where people eat each other. He turned the knob and stepped out. The air hit his face, fresh, autumnal. October in Portland, wet leaves and smoke. Smoke means something's burning somewhere. Dan quietly closed the door. He didn't lock it. If he ran back, the lock would kill him. He moved along the fence, every step deliberate. Don't step on branches. Don't brush against the fence. His own scent, sweat, soap. To the infected, he's a beacon. The first fence, he climbed over. His jacket caught on a nail. He yanked it. A crack. He froze. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Second yard. Third. The Wynn's garage. The side door is locked. A screwdriver in the lock. Click. Inside, oil and dust. The car is there. Keys on the shelf. Meticulous Mr. Wynn. Inverter on the shelf. Red box. 12 kilos. Into the backpack. Straps over my shoulders. Now the panels. On the roof. Ladder from the garage. Every step creaks. Every creak like a siren. First panel unscrewed. 20 kilos. Carried it down the ladder. The second one. While unscrewing it, I heard a screech below. Froze. Looked. An infected stood at the garage entrance. The very same one who had stood like a statue behind the fence. Now here. Head raised. Nostrils flaring. He sensed it. Sweat. A man on the roof. Dan didn't move. Didn't breathe. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The infected turned and walked away, slowly, away from the garage. Dan exhaled. His hands were shaking so much he almost dropped the panel. Finished. Carried the second one down. He picked up both, the backpack with the inverter on his back, and ran, not quietly, not carefully, as fast as he could, through 3 yards, over fences, dropping a panel, picking it up. He burst into the house, slammed the door, sat down on the floor, wrote in shaky letters. First outing. Result. 2 panels, 1 inverter, 1 near heart attack. Recommendation? Never again. But he knew there would be a tomorrow and a day after tomorrow, because the house demanded resources, and the resources were outside. The 6th day nearly became the last. Dan was connecting the panels on the roof, the inverter in the basement, a wire through the vent, the diagram from Mr. Nguyen's phone. The password was 4 zeros. Meticulous Mr. Nguyen, even in the apocalypse. The problem arose when connecting to the home wiring. A spark, a short circuit, the fuse blew. Darkness, the smell of burnt insulation. If it weren't for the fuse, the wires would have caught fire in the wall. Wooden frame, insulation, dozens of liters of chemicals in the basement. The house would have turned into a crater. Dan sat on the floor for a minute. Then he found the mistake. He'd mixed up the live and neutral wires. He fixed it. Checked it 4 times. The light came on. From the sun. Dimmer than from the mains, but it was on. He made a note of it. A rule for the post-apocalypse. If you're not an electrician, don't mess with the wiring. If you do, check it 4 times. 3 isn't enough. Day 6. Evening. 7 of them at the back fence, standing in a row, pale eyes, faces toward the house, sniffing. Yesterday's foray, a scent trail across 3 yards. They came like dogs. Dan was ready. In the morning, he'd sprayed ammonia on the kitchen floor with a spray bottle, a thin layer. He'd been waiting for this moment. The fence didn't stop them. The first one climbed over. A board creaked. The second. The third. They were heading for the back door. A blow. The lock cracked. The door flew inward. Dan threw a bucket of bleach from behind the basement door. Hypochlorite on the floor. On the floor where there was already ammonia. Chloramine rose from the floor. The basement doors closed, airtight, a chamber. 7 figures in a greenish fog, falling one after another. A blue window, +1. 7 times. Bonus. Cascading damage. Prepared ambush. Multiplier 2. 14 points. Total 21. Dan sat in the basement and studied the skill tree for an hour. Gas mixtures, level 2, 10 points. Phosgene available. Sarin gray. Doesn't understand the nuances of stabilization. The system doesn't lie. It only gives what he truly knows. Basic electrochemistry, 10 points. Electrolysis. Galvanic cells. He chose electrochemistry. The node lit up. The formulas revealed themselves. Electrolysis of aqueous solutions, producing hypochlorite by electrolysis of table salt. Every home has salt. Pass a current through the solution, you get hypochlorite, the basis of bleach, the basis of his weapon, an endless supply. As long as there is electricity and salt. 11 points left. He'll spend them later. Right now, the main thing is this. Solar panels provide electricity. Electricity turns salt into a weapon. Chemistry works. Day 7. 7 bodies from the kitchen. Again. Harder than last time because the back door was kicked in and needs to be repaired. The door from the master bedroom. Thicker. 2 bolts, a plank for support. Then washing the floor to remove the lye. Water was still coming from the faucet, a thin trickle. The pressure was dropping. Dan filled every container in the house. Pots, buckets, bottles, the bathtub. 210 liters, 3 liters a day, 70 days, until winter. In winter, rain, snow, runoff from the roof. A carbon filter, activated charcoal from wood, wood from the fence. The Henderson's barbecue, steam treatment. Fill the tube, run the water through. Disinfection with electrolyzed hypochlorite. The circle was complete. The sun provides electricity. Electricity produces chlorine. Chlorine purifies the water. Water gives life. Dan stood in the kitchen and didn't see a house, a machine, a self-sustaining system where every element is connected to every other. Chemistry at the center, as always. Day 8. Electrolysis setup. A glass jar, 2 graphite rods from batteries, a salt solution, current from the panels through the inverter, bubbles on the electrodes. The smell of chlorine. It's working. 100 milliliters of hypochlorite per hour. Not enough. Dan optimized it, increased the electrode area, cut graphite plates, raised the salt concentration. 300 milliliters per hour. Enough for 1 gas attack per day. Endless ammunition. Days 9 and 10, stationary traps, 3 of them. The first one by the front door, a bucket of bleach on a rope. The door opens, the bucket tips over. Not fatal, but it blinds and knocks out the sense of smell. The second one at the back entrance, a fishing line stretched to a glass bottle of ammonia. It falls, it shatters. A cloud. The third one in the hallway. Potassium permanganate on the top shelf. A bottle of glycerin next to it. They fall together. Contact. A flash. Fire. Unreliable, too many variables, but better than nothing. Day 10. The tap is run dry. In the morning, a wheeze in the pipes. Air. Silence. The city's water supply has run out. Dan looked to the 210 liters in various containers. Every sip now cost something. Every time he washed his hands was a decision. Day 11. The world officially ended. Not because Dan saw anything new, because he stopped hearing the old. The radio fell silent. For 3 days, the emergency frequency repeated one thing. Stay in shelters. Help is on the way. Evacuation in 24 hours. 24 hours repeated for 3 days. Then the voice cut off. Mid-sentence. Static. Silence. Dan sat with the receiver in his hands for 3 minutes. He turned it off, put it on the shelf. He wrote it down. Day 11. Radio communication terminated. There will be no help. Only our own resources. His handwriting was steady. His hand didn't tremble. But after writing it down, he sat for 10 minutes and stared at the formulas on the wall. The formulas were calm. The formulas didn't scream. The formulas didn't die. Dan stood up and went back to work. Week 2. Schedule. Up at 6. Cameras. Traps. Canned food for breakfast. A 3-month supply if he's frugal. 4 hours of work in the basement. An hour of physical exercise. Push-ups, squats, pull-ups on the heating pipe. On the first day, 10 push-ups and his arms were shaking. 20 a week later. His body had adapted. Slowly, but it had adapted. Then 2 hours of reading. Textbooks, reference books, articles on the laptop while the panels are charging it. Every day without reading is a day when he grows weaker. The system won't open what he doesn't understand. Gray icons aren't unlocked by killing, only by knowledge. In the evening, a tour of the house, checking for leaks, reagent levels, battery charge, notes in the notebook. Sleep. 6 hours. In the basement, on a mattress brought down from the second floor, wearing a respirator. Because the electrolysis unit runs at night, and the smell of chlorine doesn't completely dissipate. Day after day. Ritual. Structure. The only thing separating him from madness. On the 14th day, Dan made a discovery that changed everything. He was standing on the roof, cleaning dust off the panels. October was dry. Dust and ash from distant fires settled on the glass and reduced output. He wiped and looked out at the city. You could see far from the roof, the Portland suburbs, single-story houses, yards, fences, streets. Empty. Almost. He counted 11 infected within sight. 6 stood motionless, statues. 3 were walking slowly along the road. 1 was sitting on the roof of a car. And one was running, really running, at a speed a dead body shouldn't have, running down the middle of the street, and 4 more were running after him. But they weren't catching up. The first one was faster, much faster, and Dan realized they aren't all the same. There are the slow ones, there are the statues, there are the ordinary ones, and there are the runners. Classes, like in an ecosystem. Specialization. The prion doesn't just rewrite the nervous system, it optimizes each one for a specific task. Some become sentries, some become hunters, some become herders. This isn't a mob of the dead. It's a colony, like ants, like bees, with assigned roles. Dan climbed down from the roof and wrote 4 pages. A classification of the infected. Statues, sentries. React to stimuli within a 5-meter radius. Scavengers, patrols, 8 to 9 minute route. Runners, hunters, faster than humans, triggered by movement and scent. Sniffers, presumably, those who follow chemical trails. Haven't seen them yet, but logic suggests they exist. If the colony assigns roles, that means there are scouts specialized in scent. And if they exist, then his house, smelling of chlorine and ammonia, is the brightest beacon in the area. Dan underlined the last sentence twice. Week 3. Dan built a rainwater collection system. October in Portland means rain. Lots of rain. A gutter from the roof. A pipe into a 100-liter tank found in the wind's garage. Second trip out. Quick. To the tank and back. 3 minutes outside. Record. From the tank through a charcoal filter. He made the activated charcoal himself. Burning wood in a sealed container. Then steam treatment. Then crushing. Then packing it into a plastic tube with cotton wool at both ends. After the filter, disinfection with hypochlorite. 3 drops per liter. 30 minutes of contact. Water. Clean. Drinkable. Free. Endless as long as it rains. Dan poured a glass, looked at the clarity, transparent, sniffed. A faint smell of chlorine, like in a swimming pool. He took a sip. Ordinary water, but to him it was a marvel of engineering. His engineering. For the first time, he felt that the house could stand for a long time, not days, not weeks, months, years, unless something unforeseen happened. Dan made a note in the log. Day 21. The water supply system is operational. Output, 20 liters on a rainy day. Enough for 1 person, barely enough for 2. He wrote, for 1. He didn't expect there to be anyone else. 4th week, day 26, evening. Dan was sitting in the basement, reading a chapter from his electrochemistry textbook. He was trying to figure out the mechanism for producing hydrogen peroxide through electrolysis. If it worked, he would have a second key reagent out of nothing. Salt for chlorine, water for peroxide. He had already seen the formula in the skill tree, gray, locked, but almost understandable. Another day or two of reading and it would unlock. The camera on the tablet screen showed the backyard, empty. Front camera, the street, empty. He switched to the side camera and froze. A figure was standing by the side fence, not infected. The infected don't press their backs against the fence. The infected don't cover their mouths with their hands to keep from making noise. The infected don't cry. The figure was crying, silently, shivering, pressed against the fence and staring at the dark street where shadows shuffled. A living person. For the first time in 26 days. Dan stared at the screen and didn't move. A living person. Alive. A person. His hands clenched to the edge of the table. Then he stood up, went upstairs. He opened the second-floor window. Quiet. A figure below. A woman. A short jacket. A backpack. Hair pulled back. She didn't see him. She was looking at the street. 3 shadows were moving on the street, shufflers, a patrol route. In a minute, they would pass by the fence. In a minute, she'd be within arm's reach of 3 infected with no wall between them. Dan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and whispered into the darkness. "Hey, don't move. When I say go, run to the back door." She looked up, saw him, eyes wide, wet, mouth open. Dan shook his head. "Don't make a sound. They're coming for the noise." She closed her mouth, nodded. The shadows were getting closer. Dan threw a bottle of ammonia out the window in the opposite direction from the fence. The glass shattered on the asphalt. A sharp smell hit her like a wave. 3 sharks turned around, all 3 of them. They followed the scent, away from the fence. Dan said one word. "Now." She ran, along the fence, to the back door. Dan went downstairs, opened the door. She flew inside. He closed it, bolted it. A second bolt. A prop. That was it. She stood in the dark hallway, trembling. Dan stood across from her, wearing a respirator around his neck, in a sweater stained with chemicals, with a marker tucked behind his ear. She looked at the walls, at the formulas, at the arrows, at the diagrams, then at him, and asked where she was. Dan thought for a second, then replied that this was his home, and that it was safe here. Relatively. Her name was Hannah Lee, 28 years old, an emergency room nurse from Portland City Hospital. Her last shift had ended in a cold morgue's cold storage room. 5 hours in the dark among the corpses, listening to her colleagues up above turning. Then she left. Then she ran. 26 days. Alone, unarmed, without a plan, relying on her feet and luck. Dan listened in silence. He poured her a glass of water from his filter. She drank it in one gulp. He poured her another. She sat on a chair in his kitchen trembling, not from the cold, because for the first time in 26 days, there were walls around her, and locks, and someone was alive. Dan didn't know what to say. He'd never been good with people. In college, he was that quiet guy in the back row. In school, the one they forgot to invite to birthday parties. He sat across from a living person and said nothing. Then he said that tomorrow he'd show her how the ventilation system worked, and that there were canned goods in the house, and that the toilet worked because he'd connected to a separate tank. Hannah looked at him for a long time and said he was strange. Dan nodded, agreed. Hannah laughed, briefly, hoarsely, like someone who hadn't laughed in a month. Then she asked him to show her where she could sleep. Dan led her to a room on the second floor, his parents' old room. Clean, fresh sheets. He changed them every week out of habit. Hannah sat on the bed. She looked at the pillow, then at Dan standing in the doorway. Then she lay down, without taking off her shoes, without taking off her jacket, and she closed her eyes. 30 seconds later, she was asleep. Dan stood in the doorway and looked at the sleeping person in his house. Then he quietly closed the door. He went down to the basement. He opened his notebook. He wrote it down. Day 26. A second living person in the house. A nurse. Specialization, emergency care. Skill, critically useful. Recalculate water usage for 2. Recalculate food usage for 2. Air usage, not critical. Then he closed the notebook, sat there for a minute, and wrote a single sentence on a separate page. I am not alone. Hannah slept for 14 hours. Dan knew because he checked the camera every 40 minutes, not out of curiosity, out of calculation. If she's infected, the transformation will take 40 minutes. If she didn't get up with white eyes an hour after falling asleep, she's clean. An hour later, she hadn't woken up. After 2 hours, after 14, by this point, Dan had managed to tally their supplies for 2. Canned food, 2 months instead of 3. Water, 35 days instead of 70. If it rains, longer. It was October 20th. It would rain. Portland is always wet in the fall. He'd managed to assemble a second electrolytic cell. He'd doubled the production of hypochlorite. He'd managed to fix the camera on the side wall that had been malfunctioning from the moisture. He'd managed to read another 20 pages of the textbook. The formula for producing peroxide by electrolysis from sulfur had turned from gray to light gray, just a little more, and he managed to walk up to the stairs to the second floor 3 times to listen for her breathing. She was breathing, evenly, deeply, like a person who, for the first time in a month, didn't have to sleep with one eye open. She came downstairs in the evening without a jacket. Her hair was wet. She found the bathroom. There was enough water in the tank. Dan was standing in the kitchen, stirring rice and stew in a pot. He turned around. Hannah was standing in the doorway looking at the walls, at the formulas, at the airflow arrows, at the floor plan with color-coded zones, at the electrolysis unit humming in the corner of the basement through the open door. She asked what it all meant. Dan began to explain. From the very beginning, the system, the window, skills, the unlock tree. Hannah listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she asked if he could see her system window. Dan didn't understand. She said she had a window too, from day 1. Carrier Lee Hannah, base skill, field medicine, rank E, points. 12. She earned points for every infected person she killed on the way here, by dismemberment. 12 in 26 days, 1 at a time, no multipliers. A dull, slow path, but the skill is different. Not chemistry, medicine. Dan sat down in a chair. The system determines a skill based on the user's profession. A chemist gets chemistry. A nurse gets medicine. Everyone has their own skill tree, their own unlocks. He asked what she had unlocked. Hannah answered. Field surgery, basic. Diagnosis by symptoms, basic. Stabilization in shock. Formulas for painkillers using whatever's on hand. She hadn't used a single one. There were no conditions. There were no tools. There were no patients. Dan looked at her, and a picture formed in his mind. A chemist who makes medicines. A nurse who knows how to administer them. 2 skill trees. 2 trees that don't intersect, that complement each other. He told her one thing, that together they could do what neither of them could do alone. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said he'd chosen a very strange way to ask her to stay. Dan replied that he wasn't asking. He was offering. There's a difference. Hannah snorted, the first sound she'd made in a month, aside from trembling and crying. She said she'd think about it. In the morning, she said she was staying. Over the next 3 days, Dan set up the medical station, a room on the first floor next to the basement. His father's former study. A table, a lamp made from panels, shelves. He synthesized an antiseptic from alcohol and hydrogen peroxide. He made bandages from clean sheets, cut up and boiled. He put together a suture kit from fishing hooks, straightened and treated with alcohol, and fishing line. Hannah stood nearby and watched. Then she started correcting him. "The hooks won't work. Too thick. We need needles. Sewing needles from Mom's box in the attic. The fishing line won't work. We need thread, silk or cotton, strong and thin." Dan listened and made the changes. She spoke. He did. By the end of the third day, the medical station looked like a parody of an emergency room, but a functional parody. Hannah arranged the instruments in an order she knew by heart. A scalpel made from a razor blade in an epoxy resin handle. Clamps made from laundry clips, modified and sterilized. Syringes from the first aid kit Dan had found in the Wynn's car during the trip to get the water tank. 3 ampules of lidocaine, expired 2 months ago. Hannah said they were still usable. Dan said he could stabilize them with a buffer solution and extend their shelf life by another 6 months. She looked at him. He saw her eyes. Not gratitude, not surprise. Recognition. She recognized a colleague in him, a person who speaks a language she understands.
For the first time in years, someone treated her not as a pair of hands, but as a mind. Day 30. 1 month since the start of the epidemic. Dan noted this in the log. Day 30. 1 month. Household population, 2 people. Supplies, stable. Systems, operational. External threats, moderate. 3 attacks this week, all repelled by gas traps. Reagent consumption within normal limits. Electrolysis compensates for losses. Internal threats, none. Then he crossed out the last line, wrote it again. Internal threats, questionable. He didn't know how to live with another person, literally. He had lived alone since his mother died. 2 years, alone. Silence, order, control. Now Hannah was moving things around, opening windows in the green zone, cooking food that didn't smell like reheated canned food, speaking aloud when she thought, taking up space. Dan caught himself tensing up when he heard footsteps on the 2nd floor. Then he caught himself tensing up when he didn't hear them. It was strange, uncomfortable, and necessary. On the 32nd day, Hannah saved his life. Dan was working in the basement on peroxide synthesis, electrolysis of an acidified solution, graphite electrodes, power from the panels. The process was underway. The peroxide concentration was rising. He monitored the temperature. 23 degrees, 25, 28, 31, too fast. The current was too high. The reaction went wrong. The solution began to bubble, not as it should, aggressively, foam. Dan reached to disconnect the wires. He slipped on the wet floor. His hand jerked and knocked the jar of sulfuric acid onto the edge of the table. The jar tilted. It rolled toward the edge. Dan saw it as if in slow motion. 5 liters of sulfuric acid onto the concrete floor. Splashes. On his legs, on his arms, on his face. On the electrolysis unit where the contacts were sparking. He couldn't get there in time. His hands were full. His foot slipped. The jar was falling. Hannah. She was standing on the stairs, watching. She reacted before he could even finish the word no in his head. 2 steps down. Her hand grabbed the bottle by the neck, right at the edge. Acid splashed from the neck. A drop hit her forearm. Hannah hissed. She set the bottle down on the table, steadily. Then she grabbed a bottle of water and doused her arm. Then she looked at Dan, who stood there, pale and wet with sweat. And she told him that every conceivable safety rule in his lab had been violated, and that if he didn't remove the sulfuric acid from the table where he worked with electricity, she would personally pour it all down the drain. Dan nodded. He removed it. He treated her burn, a small one, a red spot on her forearm, nothing to worry about. But without her,
It would have been terrifying. 5 liters of sulfuric acid on bare legs, skin contact, an exothermic reaction, tissue dehydration, a third-degree burn in seconds. And if it had reached the equipment's contacts, that would have been a short circuit plus acid fumes plus a fire in the basement with the reagents. He wouldn't have survived. A chemist. Killing himself in his own lab through carelessness. The most idiotic death in the apocalypse. That evening he wrote in the log. Day 32. Laboratory incident. Cause? Safety violation. Wet floor. Acid on work surface. Lack of safety measures. Consequence? Near catalytic decomposition of operator. Measures. Reorganization of workspace. Implementation of 2-person rule for hazardous operations. Hannah Lee appointed safety officer. Reason? She's the only one besides me who lives here, and she's faster than me. Hannah read the entry over his shoulder. She said, "You don't get appointed safety officer. They just stick you with it." Dan replied that in his lab, it's the same thing. She rolled her eyes, but he saw the corners of her mouth twitch. Day 34. Raid. Our first raid together. Target? The pharmacy at the intersection 400 meters from home. 400 meters. Through a residential neighborhood, past houses, past cars, past the infected. Dan had been preparing for 2 days. The route via security cameras, counting the infected along the way, the patrol times of the sharks, the blind spots of the statues. He drew a map on a sheet of poster board. Every house, every fence, every intersection, red dots, infected, blue lines, safe passages, green windows, times when the passage is open. Anna looked at the map and said it looked like a heist plan from a movie. Dan replied that heists in movies usually end badly. She replied that they had no choice. He agreed. Gear, respirators, gloves, backpacks. Dan had 2 bottles of ammonia in his pocket. Distractions. Hannah had a crowbar. That one. 12 infected in 26 days. He tossed her a bottle of homemade hand sanitizer. She caught it. Looked at the label. He'd written on it with a marker. Sanitizer, 70%, plus 3% hydrogen peroxide. Dan's from the pharmaceutical industry. She snorted, stashed it in her pocket. They left at 6 in the morning. Dawn, fog, October, Portland. Perfect conditions. The fog masks the smell, disperses it. The infected, with their heightened sense of smell, lose their bearings in the fog. Dan knew this from his observations. He recorded everything every day: humidity, temperature, the infected's behavior, correlation. On dry, clear days, activity is 30% higher. In the fog, it's 50% lower. They walked along the fences, quietly, quickly. Hannah moved better than he did, more easily, more quietly. A month on the run had taught her. Dan stumbled. He was panting. His legs were still his weak link. First intersection, clear. The shark hun had left a minute ago, 4-minute window. Second intersection, a statue by a lamppost. They circled it in a wide arc, 5 meters, 6, just to be safe. The statue didn't move. Third intersection, a pharmacy. A glass door, smashed. It's dark inside. Dan pulled out a flashlight, a thin beam. Shelves. Most of it was empty. Looters from the first week, but the looters took painkillers and antibiotics. The stuff in plain sight, the stuff they knew about. They didn't take those. Buffer solutions, saline, insulin syringes, elastic bandages, surgical tape, tweezers, antihistamines, blood pressure meds, IV drips. Whatever Hannah pointed to, Dan shoveled into his backpack. She knew what was needed. He knew what he could do with it. Together, they cleaned out the pharmacy in 12 minutes, backpacks full, heavy. The way back, faster. The fog was lifting. The sun was breaking through. The infected would soon become more active. They ran. Dan was gasping for breath at the second intersection. Hannah grabbed his sleeve and dragged him along. They burst into the house through the back door, the bolt, the prop. Dan lay down on the hallway floor and stayed there for 5 minutes. Anna sat down next to him. She pressed her backpack to her chest. Then she said the raid had gone pretty well, for a first time. Dan replied between gasps that he hated the street. Hannah replied that the street hated him even more. Week 5. The house was changing. Not physically. Physically, Dan had been changing it every day since day 1. The house was changing in sound. Before, silence. The hum of the electrolyzer, the creak of the stairs as he walked his route. Now, footsteps upstairs, water in the bathroom, Hannah's voice talking to herself as she sorted the medicine. Sometimes she sang, quietly, to herself. Korean songs. Dan heard them from the basement and froze for a second every time. Not because it was beautiful, because it was a living sound. Human. He had forgotten what that was like. Day 36. Dan unlocked the formula for producing hydrogen peroxide by electrolysis. The gray icon turned blue. He had been reading for 3 days. The reaction mechanism. Oxidation of water at the anode, reduction of oxygen at the cathode in the presence of an oxidizing agent. A simplified anthraquinone process, not industrial, artisanal. But it worked. That was enough for the system. It wasn't testing textbook knowledge. It was testing understanding. Dan understood. 10 points. He had 11 in reserve, 1 left. But it was worth it. Now he had 2 key reagents out of nothing. Hypochlorite from salt. Peroxide from water. Salt, water, electricity. 3 basic resources from which chemical weapons, disinfectants, and antiseptics are born. Dan stood before the tree of skills and saw the nodes opening up ahead. Field pharmacology, synthesis of simple antibiotics, stabilization of biological preparations. Everything is gray. Everything requires points and knowledge. But the path is clear. The direction is clear. Day 38. Night. Dan hadn't slept. He sat in the basement in front of his tablet and calculated. A 52-day supply of canned food. Then starvation. Water isn't a problem. Electricity isn't a problem. The gas traps are working. But food. Food is finite. 45 cans of stew, 23 cans of beans, 18 bags of rice, crackers, 2 kilos of flour, a liter of vegetable oil. He was counting calories. 1,800 a day for 2 is the minimum. 1,200 is starvation. 900 means death within a month. 1,800 would last 52 days. 1,200, 78. Neither option led to the future. It only delayed the end. We need food. Fresh. A steady supply. Where from? The greenhouse. Dan had already thought of that. The living room on the first floor. A large, south-facing window, boarded up with plywood. If we remove the plywood and put in glass or plastic sheeting, light. Soil from the garden beds in the backyard. Seeds. Are there any seeds? In the garage, a box of seeds that his mother used to buy every spring. Tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, beans, peppers. Dan didn't know how to grow vegetables. He knew the soil composition. He knew the pH level. He knew what elements plants needed. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. He knew how to make fertilizer from urea. But he didn't know when to plant, how much to water, or how to pinch back the shoots. That wasn't his field. He needed a botanist, or at least a gardener, or a book. In his laptop bookmarks, he checked. Nope, not a single article on agriculture. 18 tabs on prions and catalysts. Not a single one on tomatoes. He jotted it down in his notebook. Priority, food source. Options, greenhouse. A run to the supermarket for groceries. Hunting. He crossed out hunting. He doesn't know how. A run to the supermarket is dangerous.
A supermarket is a large building with many entrances. The infected might be inside. Lots of them. Greenhouse. Long-term project. Results in 2 or 3 months. And in 2 months, the canned food will run out. Morning, Dan told Hannah. She listened. Then she said there was food for patients in the hospital warehouse. Enteral. Liquid. In bags. High calorie. 2-year shelf life. If the warehouse hasn't been looted. The hospital is 6 kilometers away. 6 kilometers. Through the center of the suburbs. Through areas with a high density of infected people. On foot. With backpacks. Unrealistic. But Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he proposed a plan. Not to go through the center. To go around it. Along the outskirts. Through the industrial zone. There are fewer residential buildings there. Fewer people lived there. Fewer infected. Longer. 10 kilometers instead of 6, but safer. And he'd make smoke bombs. Potassium chlorate plus sugar plus dye. No chlorate. Then it's easier. Nitrate from fertilizer plus sugar. There's fertilizer in the shed. There's sugar in the kitchen. The smoke is thick, white, non-toxic to humans, but it completely overwhelms the infected's sense of smell. A blind spot. 5 minutes per smoke bomb. You'll make 10. Hannah listened and nodded. Then she said 10 wasn't enough. Dan made 20. Day 40. The escape. 5 in the morning, dark, cold, November. Dan carried a backpack with smoke grenades and 2 bottles of ammonia. Hannah carried an empty backpack and a crowbar. They walked along the railroad tracks. Industrial zone, warehouses, hangars, truck parking lots. Quiet. A few infected. 2 sharks in the parking lot. They went around them. A single statue at the warehouse entrance. They went around it. Dan counted his steps. Every 500 meters he made a note in his notebook. Distance, time, number of infected. Anna walked ahead, reconnaissance, spear at the ready. She moved like a cat, quiet, alert. A month of solitary survival had taught her things Dan had learned from books. She knew when to freeze, when to run, when not to breathe. 3 hours, 10 kilometers. The hospital appeared on the horizon. A gray colossus, 8 stories. The windows were dark, some were broken. The parking lot in front of the entrance was packed with cars, ambulances, police, civilians. The doors to the emergency room were smashed. It was dark inside. Hannah stopped. Dan saw her back tense up. Her shoulders rose. She used to work here. She used to hide here in the morgue. She used to listen to her colleagues die here. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. A minute later, she exhaled. She said the storage room was in the basement. The entrance was through a side corridor, not through the reception area. Dan nodded. Side entrance, metal door, locked. Hannah knew the code, 4 digits, electronic lock, not working, no electricity. Dan took out a screwdriver. He removed the panel. Inside was a mechanical emergency lock, a key. Hannah rummaged in her pocket. She pulled out a bunch of keys. She'd carried them with her for 26 days on the run. She hadn't thrown them away. The key fit. The door opened. Inside was a corridor, dark. Flashlights, 2 beams, quiet. A smell. Dan recognized it. The smell of a hospital. Antiseptic. Blood. And something else underneath that. Sweetish, not rot. Something else. He stopped, sniffed through his respirator. Familiar. Similar to the smell of infected bodies, but weaker, old. They'd been here. Maybe they were still here. Dan raised his hand. Stop. Hannah stopped. He listened. Silence. No, not quite. Far away, somewhere above the ceiling, barely audible. Shuffling.
They were in the building, upstairs, not here, not in the basement. For now. Dan nodded. Let's keep going. Quiet. The storage room was right there, a door with a combination lock. Hannah opened it with the second key. Inside, shelves, boxes, packages. Enteral nutrition, hundreds of packages. Nutridrink, Frezubin, high-calorie formulas for patients, 200 kilocalories per bag. Expiration date until next year. Dan did the math in his head. Each bag is 200 grams. 30 will fit in a backpack, 2 backpacks, 60 bags, 12,000 kilocalories, 4 days' worth for 2 people. Not enough. But 30 such runs and we'd have a 4-month supply. No, 30 runs of 10 kilometers each through the infection zone. Unrealistic. We need a container, a cart, or bags, or a car. There are plenty of cars in the parking lot, but gas and noise. The infected will come from all over the neighborhood at the sound of an engine. Later. Now to pack the backpacks.
Dan and Hannah worked in silence, quickly. Bags into the backpack on the floor. Dan found something else on the shelf. Saline solution in liter bottles, glucose for IVs, medical alcohol, sterile gloves, surgical sutures, the real stuff, surgical needles. Hannah saw the needles and closed her eyes for a second. Then she silently put them in the backpack. Right there on the shelf were vials. Insulin. Dan read the label, Humalog, rapid acting. The expiration date had passed 3 weeks ago, but it had been stored in a cool place, the basement, most likely still usable. He took everything, 12 vials, not for himself, not for Hannah, for someone who might still need them. He didn't know who, but the chemist in him spoke up. Insulin is a complex molecule. It's impossible to synthesize. It can be stabilized. 12 vials means someone's life. He put them in the side pocket of his backpack, carefully, like glassware. Because that's exactly what it was, glassware with a life inside. The way back. The backpacks were heavy, 20 kilos on his back. Dan walked slower than he had in the morning. His legs were buzzing, his back ached. At the 6-kilometer mark, he stumbled and nearly fell. Hannah grabbed him by the strap of his backpack. "Are you holding on?" she asked with a look. He nodded. At the 8-kilometer mark, they saw the first runner up close. He was standing on the roof of a garage in the industrial zone, motionless. His head was turned toward them, pale eyes. His nostrils were flaring. Dan and Hannah froze at the same time, without a word. The runner stood there, watching, sniffing. The wind was blowing from them toward him. Their scent was wafting straight at him. Dan slowly slipped his hand into his pocket. A smoke grenade, a lighter. If the runner jumped off the roof and ran toward them, it would take 3 seconds. The runner was faster than a human, much faster. 3 seconds was all they had. Dan held the flare in one hand and the lighter in the other. Hannah stood with the crowbar raised above her shoulder. Seconds. 5. 10. 15. 20. The runner tilted his head, took a deep breath, and turned away. He walked across the roof in the other direction. Why? Dan didn't know. Maybe the wind had shifted. Maybe the smell of smoke from the smoke grenade in his pocket overpowered the scent of his body. Maybe they just got lucky. They kept going, faster, without looking back. At the 10-kilometer mark, a house, the back door, the bolt, the prop, the floor, backpacks on the floor. Dan lay face down and stayed that way for 10 minutes. Then he rolled over. He looked at the ceiling. Hannah was sitting nearby, leaning against the wall. She said the hospital was still standing. The warehouse was full. But they needed a way to get the supplies there, not with backpacks. Dan agreed. Then he said he had an idea. Hannah said she was afraid of his ideas. Dan said she was right to be. She laughed. So did he. For the first time in 40 days, he was laughing with someone, not alone in the basement.
together. It was different. That evening they sat in the kitchen and ate enteral nutrition straight from the packets. It tasted like sweet chalk, but 200 calories per packet, and vitamins, and minerals, and protein. Dan drank and thought. 600 packets in the warehouse, plus medicine, plus equipment. All of this was worth its weight in gold in the New World.
And all of it was just 6 kilometers away, in a building packed with the infected. He needed a plan. Not backpacks. Transportation, a road, a safe route, a system of smoke screens all the way. Or, he looked at the system window, the skill tree. 11 points spent, 1 left. Next to the electrochemistry branch, a node flickered gray. Means of transport, mechanical. The fine print, vehicle modification, engine noise reduction, drive electrification. Cost, 15 points. He had 1. 14 short. 14 infected. Or 7 with a multiplier, or 3 with a triple cascade. Dan closed the window. He looked at Hannah. She was chewing on a bag and staring at the wall. He said he had a plan, a big one. She said all his plans started with those words and ended with the smell of chlorine. He replied that this plan would also start with the smell of chlorine, but it would end with a car. She raised an eyebrow. He explained. We need points, lots of them. We need to destroy the infected, not one by one, en masse, in a cascade, with a multiplier. We need a big trap, not in the house, outside. Lure the infected, drive them into a confined space, gas, a chemical barrier, in one fell swoop. 20, 30, 50. Hannah asked where. Dan pointed to the map on the wall. The school, 800 meters away. The school gym, a large enclosed space. 1 door, ventilation that can be shut off. Drive them inside, lock them in, fill it up. Hannah looked at the map, then at him, then at the map again. She said he was crazy. He agreed. She said it might work. He knew. Dan unlocked the formula for electrolytic peroxide. The food situation had become critical. A joint raid on the hospital yielded a supply of enteral nutrition and medications, including 12 vials of insulin. Dan devised a plan for the mass extermination of the infected in the school gym to earn points and unlock the transport branch. Preparations for the operation at the school took 5 days. Dan didn't rush. Haste kills, especially when working with gases in enclosed spaces. Day 41. He began with reconnaissance. The school was 800 meters to the north. Lincoln Elementary School, a single-story building, brick. The gym was in a separate wing. Dan had seen it from the roof of the house through binoculars he'd found in his father's drawer. The gym windows were high up near the ceiling, narrow. An infected one wouldn't be able to squeeze through. 1 door, double doors, metal, opens outward. That's important. If it opens outward, that means it can be locked from the outside, propped shut, welded shut if he can find something to use. Ventilation. 2 grills on the wall, standard for a school gym, can be plugged. The gym's volume is about 1,200 cubic meters. To fill it with chloramine to a lethal concentration, he'll need, Dan had calculated, 60 liters of hypochlorite solution plus ammonia. 60 liters. His electrolyzer produces 300 milliliters per hour, 200 hours of operation. 8 days. No, too long. A different approach. Don't fill the entire volume. The hall is large, but if the infected are inside, they're standing, walking, breathing. They don't need to breathe a lethal concentration throughout the entire hall. They need to breathe a lethal concentration in the breathing zone. 1.50 meters from the floor. Chloramine is heavier than air. It sinks downward. If you release the gas from above, it will fill the lower part of the hall. Not the entire volume,
The bottom 2 meters. That's 400 cubic meters instead of 1,200.
20 liters, 40 hours of electrolysis, less than 2 days. But that's chloramine, weak, slow. The infected will be down for a minute. If there are 30 of them, the first ones will fall, and the last ones will make it to the door. We need something stronger. Dan opened the skill tree. Chloropicrin, field synthesis, unlocked from the first tier. Trichloronitromethane, heavier than air, 10 times more potent than chloramine. The lethal concentration is lower. He needs less. Synthesis. Chloroform plus nitric acid. Chloroform. Not in stock, but he can get it. Acetone plus hypochlorite in an alkaline medium. Halogenation reaction. He knows this. He covered it in his sophomore year. He has acetone. He can make hypochlorite through electrolysis. Is the problem. Dan sat down and started calculating. From 2.5 liters of acetone and 20 liters of hypochlorite, you can get about a liter of chloroform. From a liter of chloroform and a liter of nitric acid, about 300 milliliters of chloropicrin. 300 milliliters of chloropicrin per 400 cubic meters is 5 milligrams per liter, a lethal dose with a 5-minute exposure. Enough.
If everything goes according to plan. 3 days for the synthesis. The basement had turned into a production facility. Dan worked in a respirator with 2 carbon filters, goggles, gloves, an apron made from a trash bag. Hannah stood by the door and monitored safety procedures, her new responsibility. She took it seriously. First stage, the haloform reaction. Acetone into the flask, hypochlorite drop by drop, alkali to maintain the pH. Temperature control, no higher than 40. If it overheats, byproducts. Chloroform was distilled off from the solution. The vapors collected in a refrigerator, a homemade one, a glass tube in a bucket of ice. There was no ice. Water with ammonium nitrate. Endothermic reaction, -5 degrees. Enough. Drops of chloroform trickled into the receiving flask, slowly, 20 milliliters per hour. Dan sat and watched the drops, counting, recording. Anna brought him food. He'd forgotten to eat. She hadn't forgotten to remind him. Stage 2. Chloroform plus nitric acid. Nitration. A dangerous reaction. Exothermic. Keep the temperature below 50. Add the acid drop by drop. 1 drop per second. No faster. Dan added and counted. 1, 2, 3.
The solution turned yellow. The smell, even through the respirator, pungent, slightly sweet. Tears streamed from under his goggles. Chloropicrin, a lacrimator, tear gas, and a killer in high concentrations. By the end of the 3rd day, he had 280 milliliters in a sealed glass bottle, 20 milliliters lost. Acceptable. He sealed the bottle with wax and put it in a box of sand, away from the heat, away from impact, away from everything. Day 45. Operation Day. Dan drew a plan on a sheet of poster board and hung it on the basement wall. Phase 1. The bait. The infected are drawn by scent. They'll come from far away for a strong scent. If he takes blood from the bodies lying on the lawn and spreads it in a trail from the intersection to the gym doors, a scent corridor, they'll follow it like rails. But the blood is old. The scent is weak. We need a booster. Dan made a mixture, blood plus ammonia in microdoses. Ammonia enhances the volatility of organic compounds. The smell of blood becomes 5 times more intense. It smells disgusting, but for the infected, it's a feast. Stage 2. The pen. The gym doors are open. Inside, on the floor, is another pool of bait. They'll come in. Stage 3. Locking up. The doors are locked from the outside. Bolt, chain, padlock. Dan found a chain in the garage and a bicycle lock. Stage 4. Gas. Liquid chloropicrin in a bottle. The bottle, with a wick tied to it, sits on the windowsill of the ventilation window. The wick burns for 3 minutes. Then it burns through the rope holding the bottle.
The bottle falls inside onto the concrete floor. It shatters. The liquid evaporates. The gas is heavier than air. It fills the lower part of the hall. Step 5. Waiting. 15 minutes. Then airing out through the windows. Then counting. Hannah looked at the plan and shook her head. She said there were 40 spots where he could go wrong. Dan agreed. He said there are 40 such spots in any plan. It's important to know which ones. They left at 4 in the morning. Dark, fog. Perfect. Dan carried the backpack with the bottle of chloropicrin through the sand. He carried it carefully, like a newborn. One awkward movement and the bottle would shatter in the backpack. 300 milliliters of chloropicrin in his back. Death in 2 minutes. Hannah walked ahead with a flashlight and a tire iron.
3 smoke grenades on her belt. 800 meters to the school. 20 minutes at a quiet pace. They covered it in 25. 2 circuits. A single statue by the playground. The school stood dark and silent. The yard overgrown, swings creaking in the wind. Dan scattered the bait, a path from the gate to the gym doors, blood mixed with ammonia on the asphalt. The smell hit him even through his respirator. Hannah turned away. Dan didn't allow himself that luxury. The gym doors, open. A dark hall, empty, a hollow echo. He went inside. Flashlight. Walls. Basketball backboards. Lines on the floor, mats in the corner, ventilation grills up above, 2 of them. He plugged both with construction foam from a can he'd found at the hardware store across the street from his house. The trip the day before yesterday, quick, 3 minutes, record broken. He poured the remaining bait onto the gym floor. He placed the bottle of chloropicrin on the windowsill of the ventilation window. He tied the wick. He checked the length. 3 minutes of burn time. Checked the rope. Secure. Went out. Closed one door panel, left the other open. Chain and lock at the ready. Now to wait. They were waiting on the roof of the neighboring building. A single-story maintenance block. Flat roof. Fire escape. Good vantage point. Dan looked through his binoculars. Dawn. The fog was lifting. The sun. And they came. The first one appeared 20 minutes later. A sharkoon, walking along the road, sniffed the air, turned around. He followed the scent trail to the gym doors. He went inside. The second one 5 minutes later. The third. The fourth and fifth together. Dan was counting. By 8 o'clock, 12. By 9, 19. By 10, 27. They kept coming and coming. Some from far away. One came running, a runner. The first runner who entered the gym instead of attacking them, because the smell inside was stronger than it was on the roof. The bait was working. 2017 infected in a gym with a volume of 1,200 cubic meters. Dan decided that was enough. He climbed down from the roof, quietly, to the doors, shuffling inside, muffled sounds. They were wandering around the gym and sniffing the floor. Dan closed the second door, quietly, slowly. The door creaked. Something twitched inside. Footsteps toward the door, fast, a runner. Dan slammed the door shut. He threaded the chain through the handles. Lock, click. A blow from the inside. The door shook. The chain tightened. It held. Another blow. It held. Dan ran away. Hannah was already standing by the ventilation window with a lighter. He nodded. She lit the fuse. The flame crept along the rope. 3 minutes. They ran, away from the building, to a safe distance, 50 meters, 100. Dan counted the seconds. 120, 150, 180. Inside, they heard the sound of glass shattering. A bottle fell. It broke. A minute later, a draft came through the cracks in the doors. A faint smell, sweetish. Chloropicrin. Dan checked his respirator. Tight. Hannah did too. They stood and listened. From inside, blows against the door, then muffled thuds, then scratching, then silence.
Dan waited 15 minutes. Then he approached the door. He listened. Silence. He opened the ventilation window with a long stick with a hook. He waited another 20 minutes. The wind was drawing out the gas. He checked with a detection tube by the door. A faint trace. Another 10 minutes. Clear. He opened the door. He went inside.
27 bodies on the gym floor. The blue window flashed. +1. 27 times. Bonus. Cascading destruction. Controlled enclosed space. Elegance of the solution. Multiplier 3. 81 points. Dan's legs gave out. He sat right down on the gym floor next to the bodies. 81, +1 in reserve. 82. He opened the skill tree and stared at it for a long time. The branches glowed blue one after another. Available. Delivery methods. 15. Field pharmacology. 15. Advanced gas mixtures. 20. Antibiotic synthesis. 25. He could unlock everything, or almost everything. Dan sat on the floor of the school gym among 27 dead bodies and chose his future. He chose. Delivery methods. 15. Field pharmacology. 15. Antibiotic synthesis. 25. 55 points. 27 left. 3 branches. Transportation. Medicines. Antibiotics. He didn't choose weapons. He chose life. Hannah stood in the doorway and looked at him sitting among the bodies. She asked if everything was okay. Dan looked up. He smiled. He said he had a plan for the car, and for insulin, and for penicillin. Hannah was silent for a moment. Then she said 1 plan a day was enough for her. Dan laughed. He stood up. They went home. For the next 2 weeks, Dan didn't leave the basement. The unlocked branches on the calls unfolded like textbooks that someone had uploaded into his head. Not knowledge. Formulas. Precise recipes, proportions, temperatures, reaction times. Field pharmacology gave him buffer solutions to stabilize the insulin. He'd taken 12 vials from the hospital. The expiration date had passed. But insulin is a protein molecule. It doesn't vanish at midnight on the expiration date. It degrades. Slowly. It loses its potency. 1% per month at room temperature, 10% over 3 months. The buffer solution slows down the degradation. A phosphate buffer, pH 7.4. Dan mixed it from pharmacy ingredients obtained during a raid. He added a preservative, metacresol. You found it in ampules for injections at the Filt. Hannah brought it back on the second raid they made on the 3rd day after the operation at the school. Quick backpacks, 6 kilometers, 3 hours, there and back. Dan stabilized all 12 ampules. The shelf life was extended by 6 months. He didn't know for whom, but he knew someone would need it. Antibiotic synthesis. The branch unlocked the recipe for homemade penicillin, not industrial, rough, but it worked. Step 1. Grow mold, penicillium. It grows on bread, on citrus fruits, on any organic matter in a moist environment. Dan had bread, stale, in the attic. 2 loaves in a bag. He took them out and put them in glass jars, covered them with gauze, placed them in a warm, dark spot. Waited. On the 5th day, mold appeared on the bread. Green, penicillium or aspergillus. Impossible to tell by sight. Identification was needed. The system gave him a hint. Penicillium grows in concentric rings. Aspergillus grows radially. Dan looked through a magnifying glass. Rings. Penicillium. Step 2. Grow a pure culture. Need a culture medium. Agar. No agar. Gelatin. Yes. A packet in the kitchen cabinet. Gelatin with sugar and mineral water. Sterilize by boiling. Pour into petri dishes. No petri dishes. Saucers. Mom's porcelain saucers from the sideboard. He sterilized them with alcohol, transferred the mold to the medium with a needle.
a sterile one, scorched over a spirit lamp. Covered them with jar lids. Waited. The mold grew. The rings expanded.
Green islands on yellow gelatin. Step 3. Penicillin extraction, liquid medium. The mold produces penicillin and releases it into the solution. He needs to filter out the mycelium and extract the antibiotic from the filtrate. Extraction. Solvent. Ethyl acetate. No ethyl acetate, but it can be made. Acetic acid plus ethyl plus sulfuric acid as a catalyst. Esterification reaction. Second-year course. Basic organic chemistry. Dan synthesized ethyl acetate in a day. It smells fruity, a strangely smelling weapon against bacteria. Extraction of penicillin from the filtrate into ethyl acetate, then back extraction into an aqueous buffer solution. The result? A cloudy liquid. Penicillin. Raw, impure, but an antibiotic. Hannah ran a test. On herself. A scratch on her arm from the fence wire. It was starting to get infected. She washed it with the penicillin solution. 2 days later, the inflammation was gone. It works. Dan stood over the cup of filtrate and felt something strange. Not pride, not joy. Something more. He had made an antibiotic. In the basement. From bread and gelatin. In a world where pharmacies are empty and hospitals are dead. It was more than just survival. It was the first step back toward civilization. Day 58. Transportation. The Transportation Division had released formulas for motor electrification and noise reduction. Dan found a bicycle in his neighbor's garage, an electric motor from a screwdriver, a car battery, a drive belt from a washing machine. He assembled an electric bike in 2 days. Quiet. Maximum speed 20 kilometers per hour. Range of 15 kilometers. That's enough to get to the hospital and back. With a trailer. A trailer made from a baby stroller found in the yard 3 houses down. I reinforced the frame, added plywood sides. Load capacity, 50 kilos. First trip on the electric bike with the trailer. The hospital. Quiet. Fast. 40 minutes one way instead of 3 hours on foot. Loaded the trailer, 120 bags of enteral nutrition, medications, saline solution. Back, home, unloading. Dan stood in the yard next to the bike and looked at the trailer full of food and medicine. Hannah stepped out onto the porch. She looked, then at him. She said it was the ugliest bicycle she'd ever seen in her life. Dan stroked the handlebars. He said it was rude to insult a vehicle that saves lives. She laughed. Then she dragged the bags into the house. The 60th day. 2 months. On this day, the world around the house changed. Dan was sitting on the roof, cleaning the panels. A typical morning, a typical ritual. Binoculars, a scan, counting the infected. And he saw it. On the road 2 kilometers to the south, a convoy, not infected, people, alive, vehicles, 3 trucks, 2 pickup trucks, a jeep in front, camouflage. People with weapons on the truck beds, assault rifles. Dan counted, 20 people, maybe 25. Military? No, not military. Different uniforms. Some in camouflage, some in civilian clothes. Deserters, or militiamen. Or bandits. The convoy was moving south on the highway, not toward him, past him. But Dan watched it and felt a chill in his stomach. An organized group with weapons and vehicles, within 2 kilometers of his house. He went downstairs and told Hannah. She turned pale. She said one word, convoy. Dan didn't understand. She explained. When she was fleeing the hospital, she'd heard from other survivors, a group of soldiers, former National Guardsmen, gathering supplies, gathering people. Anyone not with them is against them. Commander. A sergeant. She didn't remember his name.
But she remembered that they were looking for specialists, doctors, engineers, chemists. Dan was silent for a minute. Then he wrote in his journal. Day 60, and organized, presumably a column, 20-plus fighters, heavy weapons, vehicles, heading south. Threat, high. Measures, reduce external signs of presence, cease smoke operations, minimize chemical odors, silence mode. He underlined the last line. From that day on, they became invisible. A week of silence. Dan removed the plywood from one window on the second floor and replaced it with clear plastic. From the outside, it looks like a boarded-up window. From the inside, you can see the street. A lookout post. He was on duty for 6 hours a day, Hannah for 6. The convoy didn't return. But Dan didn't let his guard down. On the 65th day, something else happened. Evening. The camera at the back door. Movement. Not infected, a person, small, thin, with a backpack. Running along the fence, 3 behind him, running too, but not people, runners. 3 runners chasing 1 person. Dan reacted in 4 seconds. A smoke bomb from the second-floor window, saltpeter and sugar, thick white smoke. Between the man and the runners, a wall of smoke. The runners flew into the cloud, lost their bearings, their sense of smell overloaded. 3 seconds of confusion. Dan shouted from the window, "This way, the back door!" The man bolted, small, fast, flew into the yard, through the door. Hannah closed it behind him. Dan went downstairs. Standing in the hallway was a kid, dirty, ragged, with a backpack pressed to his chest. Something was jingling. Glass. The teenager looked at Dan with huge eyes, then at the walls covered in formulas, then at Hannah, then back at Dan, and said that she had a Molotov cocktail and wasn't afraid to use it. Dan looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Dan. He told the teenager that in this house, incendiary mixtures are made by recipe, not by eye. The teenager blinked. Then he introduced himself. Manhwa Park, 17 years old, chemistry Olympiad, the school chemistry lab, the last 5 weeks. Manhwa told her story over a can of stew, a school trip to the science museum, a bus, 32 students and 2 teachers. On the way back, the driver started driving strangely. He was swerving. Then he stopped, got out, and attacked the teacher sitting in the front row. 40 minutes ago, the driver sneezed. No one paid any attention. The kids were screaming, running. Manhwa ran not toward the exit, but toward the back door. She smashed the glass with the emergency hammer. She jumped out, ran 5 blocks, ran into the first open building. A school. An elementary school, not her school. The chemistry lab on the second floor. She locked herself in. She sat down on the floor. A blue window flashed before her eyes. The system. Host. Park Manhwa. Basic skill. Applied chemistry. Rank E. Manhwa looked at Dan when she said that. He looked at her. The same skill. Chemistry. She wasn't a nurse or a soldier. She was a chemist. Like him. Junior, but a chemist. She spent 5 weeks in the school chemistry lab, alone, making Molotov cocktails out of alcohol and rags, detonating firecrackers made of sulfur and potassium permanganate, burning the infected who climbed through the windows. She earned points, few, 1 at a time. No multipliers, no cascades. A dull, slow path. But alive. 15 points in 5 weeks. She unlocked basic incendiary mixtures. She knew how to make napalm from gasoline and laundry detergent. She knew how to make a smoke grenade. She knew how to mix a thermite mixture from aluminum powder and rust. She didn't know why. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know what to do next. Until she heard a smoke grenade explode outside the window and ran toward the sound. Dan listened and saw himself. 5 weeks ago, alone in the basement,
with a notebook and a marker, with formulas on the walls. The difference was that he was 26 and working on his dissertation, and she was 17 and had a chemistry competition coming up. He asked what her score was on the competition. She said she hadn't been able to go, the pandemic. He nodded. Then he said his lab needed an assistant, if she agreed to work under supervision and not open the windows without permission. Mina stared at him, then at the basement through the open door, at the electrolyzer, at the jars covered in mold, at the walls covered in formulas. She asked if he had done all of this. Dan nodded. Mina said she agreed, and that she wasn't an assistant, but a junior colleague. Dan looked at Hannah. Hannah rolled her eyes. Mina turned out to be quick, not just quick,
Hungry for knowledge like a starving dog for meat. Dan gave her tasks. Calculate the concentration of hypochlorite needed to disinfect a liter of water. She calculated it in her head in 30 seconds. Correct. Determine the boiling point of a binary ethanol-water mixture at atmospheric pressure. She flipped through the textbook. She found Antoine's formula. She calculated it. He checked it. Her calculation was more accurate than his own, by half a degree. He recorded it in the log. Day 66. Junior colleague Park Min-ah. Calculation accuracy exceeds expectations. Competence in thermodynamics surpasses mine in several areas. Recommendation? Use. Min-ah read the entry. Her eyes glistened. She went upstairs. Hannah said she heard Min-ah crying into her pillow. Dan asked if he had said something wrong. Hannah replied that he had said everything right, for the first time. Day 70. There are 3 of them in the house. The rhythm has changed. Min-ah took charge of the electrolyzer. She monitored it. She optimized it. She increased the hypochlorite output to 400 milliliters per hour. Dan freed up time for the penicillin project. Hannah organized the medical section. In the evenings, the 3 of them sat in the kitchen. They ate, they talked. Min-ah argued with Dan about the chlorination mechanism. Hannah didn't understand a word and read a medical reference book. Sometimes, Min-ah explained chemistry to Hannah. Hannah fell asleep on the 3rd sentence. Min-ah took offense. Dan said it was normal, that when he explains chemistry to people, they fall asleep too. Min-ah said his explanations were boring. Hers were more interesting. Dan didn't argue. The house had changed. It wasn't a lab. It wasn't a fortress. It was something in between. A place where 3 people were making the impossible out of trash. And it felt like life. Day 75, mid-December. First snow. Portland wasn't used to snow. Even when it was alive, the city had been paralyzed by 2 centimeters. Now the snow covered the ruins and made the world white and quiet. The infected slowed down. Dan watched. In the cold, their metabolism dropped. The shamblers almost stopped. The statues stood dusted with snow like monuments. The runners moved, but more slowly. Winter was an ally. Dan made a note. Temperature dependence confirmed. At -5, the infected's activity drops by 70%. At -10, presumably by 90%. Winter is a window of opportunity. Time for raids, time for construction. He made a list. Solar panels, 4 more, from other neighbors. Batteries, car batteries, from cars on the street. Insulation, building materials, tools, seeds, books, fuel. Emily Carter arrived that same day. She didn't walk in, she crawled in. Dan saw her from the roof, a figure on the road, crawling through the snow, leaving a red trail. Blood. He went down, grabbed the backpack with the first aid kit Hannah had put together, went out. Hannah followed him. Min-ah stayed in the house. Surveillance, cameras, communication via walkie-talkie. The walkie-talkies were found at an electronics store 4 blocks away. A bike raid a week ago. Emily was lying in the snow 50 meters from the house, blonde hair covered in blood. Her jacket torn at the shoulder, a wound, deep. Not a bite, a cut. Glass or metal.
Hannah examined the wound right there in the snow. Not infected, not contaminated, just a wound. They dragged her into the house. Hannah stitched her up with real surgical needles from the hospital.
Rinsed it with a penicillin solution. Bandaged it. Emily was unconscious for 2 hours. Then she came to. The first thing she said was that her name was Emily Carter, 24 years old, a biologist, and that she was very thirsty. Emily survived her first week in the university dorm. She barricaded off half the floor with 2 friends. Her friends didn't make it. One got infected through a scratch on the 3rd day. The other threw herself out the window on the 5th. Emily was left alone. She ran for 2.5 months, through the woods, through the suburbs. She ate whatever she could find. She slept wherever she could. A system skill, applied botany, rank E. She knew what plants were out there, which ones healed, which ones killed. That kept her alive. But not healthy. Exhaustion, dehydration, a wound from the sharp edge of the car body she'd climbed over yesterday. She saw a house with clean windows on the 2nd floor and a light in the basement and crawled over. Dan listened to her story and thought, a botanist, applied botany, plants, a greenhouse, food, penicillin from mold, microbiology, everything he didn't know how to do, everything she knew. He told Emily one thing, that he had a box of seeds in his attic, and that he needed someone who knew how to plant them. Emily looked at him from under the bandage on her forehead, then at the jars of mold on the shelf, then at Dan. She asked if it was penicillium. He nodded. She asked what strain it was. He replied that he didn't know. Wild, from bread. She said that a wild strain yields low amounts of penicillin. We need selection, ultraviolet mutagenesis. Irradiate the spores with ultraviolet light. Surviving mutants often yield a higher antibiotic yield. Dan blinked. He looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Emily. Emily said that was basic 3rd-year microbiology. Dan replied that he was an organic chemist, not a microbiologist, and that he needed a microbiologist. Emily replied that she was more of a botanist than a microbiologist, but she remembered her 3rd-year course. Dan said that 3rd-year knowledge was enough. She stayed. Day 80. There are 4 of them in the house, a greenhouse in the living room. Dan removed the plywood from the south-facing window. He installed a frame with glass from the neighbor's house. Light. Emily brought soil from the garden beds. She mixed it with compost made from food scraps. She calculated the acidity. Dan helped with the pH meter, a homemade one. Indicator paper soaked in red cabbage juice. Red is acidic, blue is alkaline, green is neutral. They planted tomatoes, lettuce, beans under UV lamps. Lamps from an electronics store. Raid number 7. Dan kept track. The plants grew, slowly, but they grew. Emily talked to them. Mina said it wasn't scientific. Emily replied that the vibrations of her voice stimulated growth. Mina demanded a source. Emily said she was the source. Dan didn't interfere. He was working on mold mutagenesis, an ultraviolet lamp from the store, irradiating the spores. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Inoculation onto the medium. A week of waiting. Colonies, some dead, some alive. From the living ones, they selected those that grew faster, re-inoculated. Another week. Selection again. The 3rd generation produced 3 times more penicillin than the wild strain. Emily stood over the petri dish and watched. Her dissertation was on the genetic diversity of ferns. Beautiful, useless. Now she was doing what mattered. Dan saw how her face changed day by day, from lifeless to alive. 85th day. Christmas. No one celebrated. But Mina found a box in the attic with Christmas tree ornaments. She hung 3 ornaments on the ficus in the corner of the kitchen. The ficus was dead. It had dried up a month ago, but with the ornaments, it looked festive. Hannah made rice with stewed meat and added dried garlic.
It smelled almost like food. Dan brought a bottle up from the basement. Not alcohol. Distilled water. Pure. Like a tear. He said it was the purest water in the state of Oregon. Mina asked if they could make alcohol out of it. Dan replied that, technically, yes. Mina said she wanted some. Hannah said she was 17. Mina said that in the apocalypse, age doesn't matter. Emily laughed quietly in the corner. The first time in front of them, Dan wrote it down in the log. Day 85. Christmas. Population 4. Morale high. Resources stable. The ficus is decorated. Junior colleague Park demands alcohol. Request denied. He didn't write down how he felt, but that night he lay on the mattress in the basement for a long time, listening to 3 voices talking quietly upstairs.
And he thought that for the first time in 2 years, his home sounded like a home. Day 90. New Year's came without fireworks. Instead, Dan heard gunshots. Far away, to the south, bursts from automatic weapons, then silence, then another burst. The column. Dan stood on the roof and listened. Hannah was beside him. Neither of them spoke. The gunfire meant the column was close, active, and heavily armed. Dan went downstairs and held a meeting. The first official one. 4 people at the kitchen table. He laid out the situation. The column within a 5-kilometer radius. 20 or more fighters, automatic weapons, vehicles. They're looking for resources and specialists. Dan's house smells of chemicals, detectable to sniffers, which means detectable to the column's scouts. The question, what to do? Mina suggested mining the approaches. Dan said the mines can't tell the difference between humans and the infected. Hannah suggested leaving. Dan said the house is their lab, their greenhouse, their electrolyzer, their penicillin. Leaving the house means giving up everything. Emily was silent. Then she said one sentence, that the best way not to get robbed is not to look rich. Dan looked at her. She explained. From the outside, the house has to look dead, boarded up, abandoned, like all the others. No lights, no smoke, no smell. All activity inside. Airtight. Dan thought for a minute. Then he nodded. They started that very day. They sealed all the cracks. They covered the windows with black film. They switched the ventilation to charcoal filters to absorb odors. Dan set up a neutralization system. The outgoing air passed through a potassium permanganate solution. It oxidized the volatile organic compounds. The air coming out was odorless. From the outside, the house became a ghost. A dead house in a dead neighborhood. Day 93. She came at night. A knock on the back door. Quiet. Rhythmic. 3 short ones, 2 long ones, 3 short ones. So. Someone knew Morse code. Dan looked at the camera. A woman. Short haircut. Military jacket. A child on her shoulder. Small. Asleep or unconscious. Dan opened the door. The woman stepped inside, breathing heavily. The child on her shoulder. A girl, about 6 years old. Asleep. Just asleep. The woman looked at Dan, at the walls, at the formulas. She said she'd been looking for this house for 2 weeks. Based on a description. A house with formulas on the walls. Dan asked who had described it. She answered, a man from the column, a former member. He's gone. He told her there was a house where a chemist made medicine. Dan tensed. If she knew, then others did too. She saw his face. She said the man was dead, infected, 3 days ago. She was the only one who'd heard. She introduced herself. Grace Yoon, 30 years old, electrical engineer. Lily's daughter. They'd been on the run from the column for 2 weeks. Holt wanted her engineering skills. She didn't want to work for Holt. She ran away. With her daughter in her arms, through the snow, for 2 weeks. Grace was different. Not like Hannah with her dark humor.
Not like Mine with her boldness. Not like Emily with her silence. Grace was tired, deeply to the bone. But her hands? Electrical engineer. She looked at the wiring Dan had run from the panels and said it was a miracle he hadn't burned the house down. He remembered the short circuit on the 6th day and kept quiet. In 2 days, Grace rewired the whole place. Proper connections, fuses, grounding, a distribution panel made from car relays, 3 circuits, lighting.
Laboratory. Backup. The panels started producing 20% more power because wiring losses had dropped by 2/3. Dan stood and watched her work, calmly, methodically, just like he worked with reagents. Every wire in its place, every terminal stripped, every connection checked. She did with electricity what he did with chemistry. She turned chaos into order. Lily followed Dan around everywhere. She was 6. She didn't speak for the first 3 days, then she started. The first word she said in his house was, "Boom." Dan was cooking something in the basement. A small pop from overheating. Lily stood on the stairs and looked down. "Boom," she said, and smiled. Her first smile in who knows how long. Dan looked up at her. He said it wasn't a boom. It was a controlled exothermic reaction. Lily said boom. Dan agreed. Ever since then, she's called him Uncle Rocket. The 100th day. There are 6 of them in the house, including Lily. Dan has counted everything. Water, enough. Rainwater collection plus snowmelt. Food, just enough. Enteral feeding from the hospital. Canned food. The greenhouse isn't yielding a harvest yet. First tomatoes in a month. Electricity. Enough. Grace optimized it. Safety. 6 people in a 3-bedroom house. Cramped, but warm. Grace and Lily in the former parents' room. Emily and Mina in Dan's room. Dan and Hannah took her father's study, which has been converted into a medical station. Dan is in the basement on a mattress, as always. He wrote it down. Day 100. Population 6. Chemist, nurse, chemistry intern, biologist, electrical engineer, child. Resources stable. Morale. He thought for a moment. Then he wrote, morale is fragile. 6 people in one house, 6 personalities, 6 stories of pain. Sooner or later, something will snap. We need a way out. We need space. We need a goal beyond survival. Day 102. The electricity went out in the evening. Not in the house, in the string lights. The old Christmas string lights that Mina found in the attic and hung on the dead ficus tree. A bulb had burned out. Lily started crying. Quiet, silent, tears running down her cheeks. Grace hugged her. Dan went down to the basement. He came back an hour later with a string of lights. Not that one, a different one, made from LEDs soldered off a flashlight. 12 of them on a wire. He hooked it up to a battery. 12 lights came on, white, small, but bright. He hung them on the ficus tree. Lily watched. She stopped crying. Then she said, "It's beautiful." Grace stood in the doorway. Her face was wet. She didn't say anything. Sora, who hadn't appeared in their lives yet. Later, when she hears this story, she'll say that Dan is unbearable. Hannah will write it down in the medical journal she kept alongside Dan's journal. Day 102. Dan synthesized childhood. The group's reaction was emotionally stabilizing. Recommendation? Repeat. Grace Yoon, an electrical engineer, arrived with her daughter Lily after fleeing the column. She rewired the entire house. There are 6 people in the house. The house is disguised from the outside to look abandoned. Dan put together a string of LED lights for Lily. The threat from the column is growing. Day 110. Sora Che came to rob the place. Dan woke up to the sound of a trap on the front door going off, a bucket of bleach, a thud, a splash, a scream, a woman's, angry, then cursing in Korean. Dan knew Korean, not perfectly, but enough to understand that the woman at his door was swearing like a dock worker. He got up.
put on his respirator out of habit.
Grabbed a flashlight, stepped out into the hallway. A girl was standing at the door, soaked in bleach, short haircut, a scar on her eyebrow, a knife in her hands, a hunting knife, a big one. She was blinking, bleach in her eyes. It stung, but she held the knife. Dan stopped 3 meters away. He said in Korean that bleach wasn't dangerous at that concentration. It just stings. She froze. Then she asked, also in Korean, how he knew Korean. He replied that his parents were from Seoul. She lowered the knife by 1 centimeter, then raised it again. She introduced herself. Sora Che, 22 years old, staff sergeant, Seoul. She came to visit her aunt in Oregon, got stuck. Her aunt is dead. She's alone. 3.5 months, with a knife and a gun. The gun is empty. She used the last bullet a week ago, at a runner. Missed. No food. She came to loot because someone on the radio said there was a house with supplies in this neighborhood. Dan asked who had said it on the radio. Sora shrugged. A stranger's voice, the column's frequency. Dan went cold. If the column was talking about his house on the radio, that meant they knew. The cover-up hadn't worked, or hadn't worked completely. He made a mental note of it. He'd figure it out later. Right now, standing before him was a hungry, armed girl with a buzz cut and the eyes of someone who'd been killing for 3 months just to survive. Dan invited her in. To eat. Dry off. Sora said she didn't trust him. Dan said that if he'd wanted to kill her, the trap would have been laced with ammonia, not bleach. Sora thought about it. She went inside. After 20 minutes of conversation, she realized 3 things. First, Dan wasn't a threat. Second, Dan was more useful alive than dead. Third, this house is warm and smells of food, and people live here. She put the knife away. She said she was staying. She didn't ask if she could. She declared it. Dan didn't argue. He needed a fighter, someone who could hold the perimeter, who could shoot, who knew tactics. Sora was all of that. She looked at his traps and said they were amateurish. Dan agreed. She rebuilt them in 2 days, tripwires in new positions, firing angles, observation sectors. She thought like a soldier. Dan thought like a chemist. Together, they turned the house into something terrifying. The trap at the entrance was no longer just a bucket.
It was a system of 3 sequential barriers. The first one, blinds. The second one, disorients. The third one, kills. Sora drew a diagram. Dan filled it with chemicals. She told him what was needed. He told her what to use. They argued loudly. Mina listened from the stairs and ate rice. Hannah rolled her eyes. Grace covered Lily's ears. Day 115. First real contact with the column. A reconnaissance team, 3 people. They appeared on the street 100 meters from the house. Camouflage. Assault rifles. They walked slowly. They searched the houses one by one. Dan saw them from his observation post. Sora was nearby, with an empty pistol, which looked like it was loaded. The 3 reached Dan's house. They stood by the fence. One approached the door. He pushed it. Locked. He knocked. Silence. He peered through the window. Black film. Couldn't see anything. He shrugged. Told his partners it was empty. They left. Dan held his breath for 4 minutes. Then he exhaled. Sora said that next time they might come in. Dan knew. We need a plan, not to protect the house, to protect the people. If the column came with 20 fighters, no traps, no gas, no walls would save them.
They needed something else. An escape route, a safe haven, a second house. Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he announced it. They were building a network. Not just one house, several, connected by walkie-talkies, with supplies in each. If one fell, people would move to another. Like partisans, like a mushroom colony.
You cut down one mushroom and the roots have already sprouted a new one. Sora said that was sensible. For the first time since she'd arrived, she said something encouraging to Dan. He wrote down the date. Day 120. 4 months. Dan and Sora found 2 houses within a 2-kilometer radius. One was empty, brick, with a basement, a good one. The second? Wooden. No basement, but with a garage. They moved supplies into each one: water, food, first aid kit, walkie-talkie, smoke grenades. Instructions on the wall, written in Dan's handwriting. How to turn on the walkie-talkie, how to use a smoke grenade, how to purify water, how to apply a suture. Basic survival kit, for anyone who finds it. Hannah added medical instructions. Manhwa added the chloramine formula with a note. Mix only in a well-ventilated area. Seriously, no joke. You will die.
Sora added a home defense plan with firing zones. Emily added a list of edible Oregon plants with illustrations. Grace added a solar panel wiring diagram. Dan looked at the walls of the emergency shelters covered with instructions in 6 different handwritings. And he realized that this was more than just safe havens. It was a beginning. The beginning of something bigger than the survival of a single family. A book, written on the walls, for those who come after. Day 130. The snow was melting. Spring. The infected were waking up. Dan saw it every day from the roof. The statues that had stood all winter began to move. The shufflers picked up speed. The runners returned to their former pace, and new ones appeared. The sniffers. Dan had predicted their existence back in the fall. Now he saw them. They were different from the rest. Skinny, heads constantly raised, nostrils flared. They didn't run. They walked, slowly and purposefully, following the scent. One passed by the house, stopped, tilted its head, stood there for a long time. Dan held his breath. The charcoal filters in the exhaust hood absorbed the smell, but not all of it. Traces of chlorine, traces of ammonia. Imperceptible to a human, but not to a sniffer. It stood there for 2 minutes. Then it left. But it will return. They always return. Dan made a note. Threat level, critical. Sniffers are active. Filtration is insufficient. Complete sealing is needed, or a switch to other reagents, or evacuation. Day 135, the Great Siege. Night, 3 in the morning. Sora, on duty, saw the first one, then the second. Then she stopped counting. They were approaching the house from all sides. Sharkoons, runners, and 3 sniffers at the head, over 30 of them, drawn by the lingering scent. Dan reacted within 2 minutes. Everyone upstairs, 2nd floor, sealed zone, lock the stairwell door. Hannah carried Lily. Grace carried the first aid kit. Emily carried the jars of mold. Manhwa carried the laptop with the recordings. Sora was last. The door, the bolt. Dan was in the basement, alone, at the circuit breaker. 3 switches on the wall. He pressed the first one. The electromagnetic lock on the front door. Unlocked. The door opened. They scrambled inside. He flipped the second one. A bucket of chloramine in the hallway. It tipped over. The gas started flowing. He flipped the third one. The hallway ventilation was shut off. The basement was open. The gas remained in the hallway and kitchen. It didn't go down into the basement. It didn't rise upstairs. He sat behind the cameras and counted. They were coming in, falling. They entered. They fell. 10, 15. The gas was weakening. The concentration was dropping. The 20th one entered and didn't fall. He kept going, over the corpses, toward the basement door. Dan stood up. He took out the second container. Chloropicrin, 100 milliliters, a spare. He poured it into the tray by the door. The liquid evaporated. Heavy gas crept across the floor, under the door into the hallway. The 20th fell on the threshold. The 21st followed him.
Then silence. Dan waited an hour, aired it out, checked. 26 bodies. 4 had left when the gas cleared. Blue window. 26. Multipliers. 78 points. Dan wasn't happy. He looked at the bodies in his hallway and thought that next time there would be more, and that there was only enough chloropicrin left for one more attack, and that the sniffers now knew where he was. In the morning, he made the announcement.
The house remains the base, but we need a second line of defense. We need people at network checkpoints. We need a radio on constant standby. We need an early warning system. Sora nodded. She'd already thought of that. She suggested drones, kids' quadcopters from a toy store, a camera, 500-meter range, risk-free reconnaissance. Dan looked at her, then at the skill tree, the delivery methods branch, sub-branch. Unmanned aerial vehicles, chemical carriers, 20 points. He had 105, unlocked. The formulas revealed themselves. Modification of household drones, installation of dispensers, aerosol sprayers, remote control. Dan and Sora sat working on the quadcopter and modified it for 3 days. Sora soldered. Dan calculated the payload. The result? A reconnaissance drone with a camera and an aerosol tank. 50 milliliters of chloropicrin at a height of 10 meters. A precision strike, no risk to people. Sora launched it for the first time and watched it fly. A small buzzing square in the gray sky. Then she turned to Dan. She said it was the first thing she'd ever made with her own hands that didn't kill, but protected. Dan replied that the drone actually did kill. Sora said she knew, but in a different way, from a distance, without blood on her hands, and that it's better. Day 150, 5 months. Dan sat in the basement and looked at the letter from his father. He hadn't opened it since the first day. It was sitting in his laptop, in his inbox, unread. The subject line, "Son, I need to tell you something." Dan was afraid of that letter, not because he was afraid to find out his father was dead. He'd accepted that a long time ago. He was afraid of finding out something worse. Something that would explain why the system had chosen him specifically. That night, Lily was sick, a fever, 39 degrees. Hannah was keeping watch by her bed. Grace sat nearby. She wasn't crying, she was just sitting there. Lily whispered that she wanted ice cream, real ice cream, like before. Grace covered her face with her hands. Dan silently got up and went down to the basement. 2 hours later, he returned with a bowl. Fruit ice, old jam from the attic, chilled via an endothermic reaction, ammonium nitrate and water, -5 degrees in 3 minutes. Lily tasted it, said it was delicious. Grace went to the kitchen and cried for 20 minutes. Sora, passing by Dan, silently patted him on the shoulder. Hannah wrote it down in the journal. Dan synthesized his childhood. After Lily fell asleep, Dan went down to the basement and opened the letter. His father wrote in Korean, long, confused, like a man who had been gathering his courage for a long time. The gist: his father worked in Seoul, not at a hospital, at a research center, biotechnology, a private contract with a government agency. He didn't know the details of the project. He was a technician. He maintained the equipment. But he saw something. Samples, documents on desks, conversations in the hallways, the word prion, the word vector, the word control. He didn't understand, but he sensed that something was wrong. He wrote to his son. He didn't explain. He didn't have time. The connection was lost. Dan read and reread it 3 times. Then he closed the laptop. He sat down on the floor and sat there for an hour. His father, a technician in the lab that created the prion, not a scientist, not a villain, a technician who repaired autoclaves and wiped down centrifuges, and who saw enough to be afraid, and not enough to stop it.
The system didn't choose Dan by accident. It knew his last name, knew his skill, knew his father was on the inside. Dan took out his notebook. He wrote it down. The epidemic is not natural. The prion was created artificially. His father was indirectly involved in the project. The system selects carriers based on criteria that are not random. Conclusion: the system is part of the project. Not assistance, observation. Someone is watching. Someone is in charge. Someone is waiting. He closed the notebook, lay down. Didn't sleep until dawn. Day 160. Conflict with the Pure Ones. They came in the afternoon, 10 people, without firearms, with torches, with cans of gasoline, with crosses around their necks. They stood by the fence. One stepped forward. He spoke loudly. That science had killed the world. That chemistry was the devil's poison. That the house where poison was made needed to be burned, along with those inside. Dan stood by the window and listened. Sora was nearby with an empty pistol. Hannah and Lily were on the second floor. Mina was in the basement preparing smoke grenades. Emily was at the door to the medical bay. Grace was at the distribution panel. Dan grabbed the walkie-talkie. He went out onto the roof. He looked down. 10 people. Fanatics. But people. Living people. He didn't want to kill them. He didn't want to. He shouted down that there was a child in the house, that they could leave, that no one would shoot. The preacher below said that the alchemist's children would burn along with the alchemists. Dan gripped the radio so hard the plastic creaked. Then, in a calm voice, he gave the order. Sora, smoke. North sector. Mina, chloramine through the ventilation into the fence area. Low concentration, not lethal, deterrent. Grace, lights. All spotlights on the fence. 3 commands simultaneously. Smoke, gas, lights. The uninfected started coughing. Their eyes watered, blinded by the spotlights. They ran. 9 out of 10. The 10th. The preacher. He didn't run. He threw a can of gasoline over the fence, lit a torch, threw it after. Gasoline on the ground. The torch in the gasoline. Flames. By the wall of the house, wooden siding. Dan saw it from the roof. Fire by the wall of his house. By the wall where Lily had been sleeping an hour ago. Sora ran out the back door with a fire extinguisher. Foam on the fire. She put it out in 20 seconds. The preacher stood by the fence and watched. Sora turned toward him. The preacher reached for a second torch. Sora didn't think. Hannah's crowbar lay by the back door. She grabbed it. One blow. The preacher fell. He didn't get up. Sora stood over him, breathing heavily. She looked at Dan on the roof. Dan was looking down. The preacher wasn't moving. Dead or unconscious. A minute later, it became clear. Dead. Sora had killed a man. Not an infected one. A man. The first time for her. No, not the first. She had been a sergeant. But the first time it wasn't an order. It was a decision. Her decision. She stood over the body and said nothing. Dan came down. He approached. He stood beside her. He said nothing. He stood there. Then Sora turned and went into the house, locked herself in her room. Dan took the body away, alone, in the dark. Then he sat on the porch until dawn. Hannah came out at 4 in the morning, sat down next to him, silently. For 2 hours before dawn, they sat on the porch in silence. Dan couldn't speak. Hannah didn't try to make him. She just sat there. And that was enough. Day 180, 6 months. Dan stood on the threshold of his house and looked at the world he had built. The network was working. 4 houses, connected by walkie-talkies, supplies, and instructions in each. 2 former column fighters had left Holt and joined the network, not to Dan's house, to Point 2, a brick house with a basement. Dan relayed the formulas to them over the radio: how to purify water, how to assemble a filter, how to make an antiseptic. They listened and took notes. Then one of them got on the radio and said his wife was diabetic. They ran out of insulin 2 months ago. She's dying. Dan closed his eyes, opened them. He took 4 vials of stabilized insulin out of the air-cooled refrigerator. He gave them to Sora. Sora rode her bike, 2 kilometers. She delivered them. The woman got her shot, her first in 2 months. She survived. The next day, 3 more people from the column came in on the radio. They said they wanted to leave, that one of them had a child with asthma. Dan passed along the formula for a bronchodilator made from ephedrine, which can be extracted from a plant, which Emily had identified in a vacant lot 200 meters from the house. The 3 left Holt. Holt noticed. Day 205. He came alone, not with the army, with 3 people, a white flag on the Jeep's antenna. Dan saw it from the roof. Sora was next to the drone holding the remote. Chloropicrin in the dispenser, 50 milliliters, a precision strike. But Dan told them to wait. Holt got out of the Jeep. Tall, broad, short-cropped hair, a face like an axe. He stood by the fence. He said loudly that he wanted to talk. Dan went downstairs. He stepped out onto the porch wearing a respirator, in a sweater knitted by Grace. They stood on opposite sides of the fence and looked at each other. Holt spoke calmly, like a business partner. He said he respected what Dan had built, that a single house in the suburbs is nice, but small scale, that humanity needs industrial chemistry, needs tons of antibiotics, not a jar, needs tanker trucks of disinfectant, not a bucket, that he has people, transportation, territory, resources, that Dan could get all of that in exchange for work, on his terms. Almost. Dan listened. He was silent. Then he answered. He said the difference between him and Holt was in one word. He works for a specific person. Holt wants him to work for abstract humanity. But abstract humanity is just a word used to cover up control. Holt frowned. He said Dan was naive, that one house wouldn't save the world. Dan replied that he wasn't going to save the world. He was going to teach the world to save itself. Then he pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket. He handed it over the fence. Holt took it, read it. Instructions. Synthesis of an insulin stabilizer from readily available components. Step by step. With dosages, with warnings, with diagrams. Dan said it was free for all of Holt's fighters who have family members with diabetes. Holt looked at the sheet, then at Dan. His face changed. It didn't soften, it shifted, like a man who had recalculated an equation and gotten a different answer. Dan knew what would happen next, because he had calculated Holt like a chemical reaction. Holt wouldn't shoot. A dead Dan is useless. Holt wouldn't take him by force because Dan had already given away for free what Holt wanted to make him work for. And if Holt took the man who was giving out medicine for free, his own men wouldn't forgive him. Half his fighters had already received the formulas from Dan over the radio. Half already knew that Dan was sharing. Taking Dan meant becoming an enemy to his own men. Holt understood that. He stood there for a long time. Then he put the piece of paper in his pocket. He said that Dan had won this round. Dan replied that he wasn't playing. Holt smirked. He turned around, got into the Jeep, drove away. The following days tore the column apart like acid corrodes metal. Dan went on the air on the column's frequency, in coded language, every evening at 9. He read instructions, how to purify water, how to make an antiseptic, how to stabilize medicine, how to assemble a charcoal filter, how to grow food in the basement.
The voice of a graduate chemistry student muttered formulas in the dark, and dozens of people listened, tens of kilometers around. Holt's fighters were leaving one by one, two at a time, with their families, to the network's checkpoints, to the instructions on the walls, to the formulas that gave life, not death. Holt wasn't losing men in battle.
He was losing them because Dan gave away for free what Holt made people pay for. By the 220th day, Holt had 8 men left, then 5. Then he left, alone, into the blizzard. February, snow. Dan stood in the doorway and watched as Holt's figure disappeared into the white expanse. Everyone stood nearby. Hannah, Mina, Emily, Sora, Grace with Lily in her arms. And in the doorway, wrapped in a coat, a woman they didn't know. Tall, bespectacled. She'd shown up 3 days ago, introduced herself, Dr. Iris Chan, a virologist, a former CDC employee. She said she knew more about the system than she should, and that she'd come with a proposal. Dan hadn't decided what to do with her yet, but he watched as Holt disappeared into the snow and said quietly, addressing no one in particular, "All right, we've dealt with that. Now for the cure." Sora snorted nearby. She said he was unbearable. Dan smiled. A light was on in the living room window, electric, steady. On the table, tea brewed with rainwater through a charcoal filter was cooling. An exhaust fan hummed in the basement. It didn't smell like chemicals. It smelled like home. A year later, Dan was standing in the basement of an abandoned research center in the mountains, 120 kilometers from home. 3 months of searching. Iris had led him there. She knew where it was, because she used to work here, because she was one of the people who created the prion. When she told him, Dan didn't speak to her for 2 days. He sat in the basement and stared at the wall. Then he came out. He said one thing, that he had no right to forgive for the billions who died, but he had the right to give her a job. Iris nodded. They began. The research center stood empty. The generators were dead. The labs were abandoned. But the server room in the basement, it was working. On backup power, solar panels on the roof, industrial batteries, enough to last a year. Data on the servers, the project, complete documentation. The prion, structure, mechanism of action, the infection vector, and the system. The system's code. Not magic, not divine intervention. A program, a neural interface. The prion embedded itself in the nervous systems of the living. It didn't kill. It overrode. It added a layer, an interface, survival system. It was part of the project, not a side effect. The goal. The prion was supposed to kill. The system was supposed to select. Those who survive, those who adapt. Those who can restore what has been destroyed. Selection. Humanity passed through a filter. The result, those who can think. The result, Dan. He stood in front of the server screen and read. Files, reports, meeting minutes. One document was marked in red. Last modified, the day before the leak. Author, A. Chan. Iris stood behind him, silent. Dan read. Iris had made a change to the protein the day before the leak. The leak was no accident. The prion was meant to be a weapon, to kill without a trace. Clean. Quiet. Population control. Iris added a single gene, a single protein, one that made dead bodies rise, which made the consequences visible, which turned a quiet killing into an apocalypse that couldn't be hidden. She wanted the world to see what they were doing under the ministry's roof. The world saw and died. Dan closed the file. He turned to Iris. She stood there, waiting. Her face was pale. Her eyes behind her glasses were unmoving. She was waiting for the verdict. Dan was silent for a long time.
Then he said he hated what she had done.
That he wouldn't forgive her. That he had no right to forgive her. But that these files contained the prion's structure, the complete structure. And if he knew the structure, he knew how to destroy it. Denaturation, targeted, anti-prion, a molecule that breaks down what the prion has built up. Iris looked at him. For the first time in the months they'd known each other, her eyes welled up. She asked if he could do it. Dan said he didn't know, but he'd try. Because it was the only thing that made sense. The following year was the hardest, and the most important. Dan moved some of the equipment from the center to the house. A centrifuge, a spectrophotometer, a microscope, chemicals, real ones, laboratory grade, not household. The basement became a real laboratory, not a parody, a laboratory. Iris worked with him. 2 scientists, a chemist and a virologist. Dan understood the chemistry of bonds. Iris understood the biology of proteins. Together they saw the prion in its entirety, like an architect sees a building from both the outside and the inside. Minnie helped with the calculations, Emily with the cultures, Hannah with testing on tissue samples. Grace handled the electricity and equipment. Sora guarded the perimeter and transported samples between the lab and network points, where other survivors sent data. The network had grown. 20 houses, hundreds of people. The walkie-talkies came on every evening at 9. Dan's voice, instructions, formulas, and now progress reports. We're working. We're searching. We'll find it. The 3rd year, spring. Dan stood in the basement in front of a flask, a clear liquid, anti-prion, the key molecule, which enters the prion protein and breaks it down from the inside, like a lockpick that opens a lock and breaks it at the same time. He synthesized it over 8 months of work, 114 attempts, 113 failures, the 114th. He tested it on a sample of infected tissue, under the microscope, cells, prions in the cells. He added a drop of anti-prion. He waited. An hour. 2. By the 3rd hour, the prion structures began to disintegrate, slowly, but irreversibly. The protein was breaking down. The chains were snapping. The cells were being released. Dan looked through the microscope and couldn't look away. Iris stood nearby. She was watching too.
She couldn't look away either. Emily walked into the basement. She saw their faces. She asked what had happened. Dan looked up. His eyes were shining. He said it was working. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth. Then she ran upstairs. A minute later, everyone was standing in the basement. Hannah, Mina, Sora, Grace, Lily, who was now 8, Iris, and Dan. In front of a flask of clear liquid, Hannah asked what it meant. Dan said it meant that what had been put together could be taken apart, that the infection was reversible, that the dead wouldn't come back to life. No, but the living wouldn't become dead anymore, that the epidemic could be stopped. Not today, not tomorrow. Testing is needed. Scaling up is needed. It will take months. But the formula exists. The foundation exists. The beginning exists. Mina asked how much anti-prion would be needed to clear Portland. Dan did the math in his head. He gave a number. Mina whistled. Sora asked how to deliver it. Dan said they'd have to think about that. Grace asked if there would be enough electricity. Dan said they'd have to build a generator. Emily asked if the components could be grown. Dan said some could.
Lily asked if that meant they'd be able to walk outside. Dan looked at her. 8 years old. She didn't remember a world without the infected. Didn't remember stores, schools, parks, friends. Real ice cream, not the kind made from jam and ammonium nitrate. He crouched down, looked her in the eyes. He said yes. We'll be able to go out. Not now, but soon. Lily nodded. She said, "Okay, Rocket Uncle. I'll wait." Dan stood up. He looked at his team. 7 people and a child.
in the basement of a house in a Portland suburb, with a flask of anti-prion on the table, with a skill tree in which dozens of blue nodes were glowing, with a network of 20 houses waiting on the radio, with a recipe book written on the walls for those who would come after. He didn't save the world. He isn't a light novel hero. He's a graduate student in chemistry who spent 3 years brewing in the basement what specific people needed. Sometimes it was a weapon, sometimes medicine, sometimes ice cream. He opened his notebook. That very one, from day one. 42 inventory items. And he wrote on the last page, Anti-prion version 1, working. Next step, scaling, synthesis, delivery, testing, timeline.
Unknown, but the direction was right. Then he closed the notebook, set it on the table, looked at the flask, at the liquid inside. Clear, like water. Like the water he'd purified on the 21st day through a homemade charcoal filter. Back then it had seemed like a miracle. Now the miracle stood in the flask and waiting to be released into the world. Dan took off his respirator, hung it on the hook by the door, went upstairs. The light was on in the kitchen. There was tea on the table. A map of the network hung on the wall. 20 dots, 20 houses, hundreds of people. The yard was visible from the window. The snow was melting. Spring. The third spring since the beginning of the end of the world. Emily had planted flowers by the porch, nasturtiums, small ones, orange ones. Superfluous, beautiful. Dan looked at them through the glass. Then he sat down at the table. He picked up a cup, took a sip. Tea brewed with rainwater through a charcoal filter, as always. Hannah sat across from him. She asked how he was feeling. Dan thought for a moment. Then he answered that he felt like a man who had a home and a job and people worth working for.
And a formula that could change everything. And tea.
Hannah smiled. She said that for a chemist, he sometimes spoke almost like a human being. Dan smiled back. Outside the window, the snow was melting. In the basement, the exhaust fan hummed. On the roof, Sora's drone buzzed. In the greenhouse, Emily's tomatoes were growing. In the medical supply room lay Hannah's medicines. Mina's formulas glowed on the walls. Grace's relay clicked quietly in the control panel. In the yard, Lily was drawing a sun on the asphalt with chalk. The house stood, strong, alive, smelling not of chemicals, of home. Knowledge had become home. Dan discovered the research center where the prion was created. He learned the truth about Irie and Chan and the origin of the epidemic. Over the course of a year, he synthesized the anti-prion, a functional molecule capable of destroying the prion protein. The network had grown to 20 houses. The head lay scaling up and distribution of the drug. The story ends in the spring of the 3rd year. The house stands. The team is together. The anti-prion is ready for testing. Knowledge has become a home.